Welcome to our next session of Online Chess Club. Today I have a couple of things that I want to show you. One is a follow-up from last time where, as you recall, we were talking about different openings and we looked at the Evans Gambit. I'm going to show you that in just a minute. But first I want to show you an Endgame Checkmate that we haven't really discussed. Many of you have asked me, how do I attack the castle king? And so I want you to look at this position for just a minute and to think about what white can do and what black can do. Notice that white's king is behind these three pawns. So the black queen could come down here and that would be checkmate in one. So if it's black's turn, they will win the game. This is why I say over and over again, it's really important to remember whose turn it is, because in fact, it's not black's turn to move, it's white's turn to move. And I want to show you this checkmating pattern. It's called Anastasia's mate. Anastasia is a woman's name, and it comes from a story. And this is a really famous checkmating pattern, and you can look at it online, but I'm going to show it to you for now. It involves a knight and rook checkmate. The rook is going to be the checkmater, and the knight is the helper. It also involves a queen sacrifice, meaning that the queen will come down and she will let herself be captured in order to find checkmate. Very important that you can checkmate without your queen. Your queen is very powerful, but she can also be a very powerful sacrifice. So this is how it looks. The knight comes here and says check. Notice the rook is lined up here in this instance. The knight says check, driving the king into the corner. So the king in check must get out of check. Knights cannot be blocked. This knight cannot be captured right now. And so the king must move. So the king moves here to the corner to h8. Now the queen comes down to check here. This is the sacrifice. The queen comes here and says check. Again, the king has no choice. The queen is checking and she guards here and here. So the king must take. So the king takes. Now, remember, we've talked about it with back rank checkmates and with a king and a king and rook checkmate, that all you need is a wall of 3 on a file or a rank to block in the king. In this pattern, the king cannot go here, and the knight guards these two critical squares. So we have that important wall of at least 3 squares. The king cannot go here, the king cannot go here, and the king cannot go here. So all you need to do is checkmate him against the wall. And you see this rook? The rook slides over and says checkmate. The rook is the checkmater. The knight is the helper guarding these squares. And that's the basic pattern for Anastasia's mate. Queen sacrifice followed by checkmate with the rook. And you're going to see that in the next game I'm going to show you. Hold on for just a minute while I reset the board. All right, I have reset my board and we are ready to talk about this game. Now remember, I'm going to show you 2 things in this game. We're going to talk about the Evans Gambit, which we saw last week. And then at the very end, we're going to talk about Anastasia's mate and that important checkmating pattern. Now in this game, white is going to play the Evans Gambit, but it's black that's going to turn the tables on white and checkmate with Anastasia's mate. So you're going to want to look for that. So at the beginning, we're going to watch white's moves for the Evans Gambit, and the end, we're going to really look at the attack that black mounts against white. Now in this game, there are 2 Austrians playing. This game was played in 1852, which was the same year that the Evergreen game that I showed last week was played. And white is going to be played by a chess master named Conrad Baer. Conrad Baer was a player who loved to create chess problems. He would write about chess problems. He liked to think about the kind of creative problems that one could make on the chessboard and then solve, just like crossword puzzles or any other kind of puzzles, but he would do it at the chessboard. Falkenbier plays the black pieces. And he was also a journalist. He was a chess master and a journalist and founded the very first Austrian chess magazine. So we're going to see these two players from Austria play out this game. White's going to do the Evans Gambit, and black ultimately will checkmate. So if you remember the Evans Gambit is where you give up a pawn for a particular position, trying to create an asymmetry to the board so it's not all really tight in the center. White will begin their attack along these diagonals down in that direction. So we want to look for that. The Evans Gambit starts like you've seen before, e4, e5. The knight comes out to f6, attacking that center pawn, and black defends the center pawn. Then the bishops come out. White bishop comes out to c4, attacking Foolish Freddy, the weak pawn, and the black bishop comes out. Now this position is where you can play the Evans Gambit. Remember, we talked about this last time, that you may have an idea of what you want to play, but you can't be sure you can play it until the pieces are in position. The conditions are right here to play the Evans Gambit. And this is what it looks like, if you remember. The B pawn comes out to attack the bishop. If black accepts the gambit, they take that pawn. And then white attacks the bishop again with c3, attacking the bishop, getting these diagonals open for the white bishop and the white queen to come out. And the bishop backs up to a5. Now white has a chance for the two pawn center, which they take. They move this pawn out, which releases this bishop and also attacks that pawn, and that pawn takes. We saw this exactly last week. The pawn takes here, excuse me, got it? The pawn takes, and rather than retake, just like last week, white decides to castle. 1, 2, Scooby-Doo, protecting the king and activating the rook. Remember, castling does two important things at once. Once he's castled, black moves this pawn up here to release this bishop to pin the knight. I know you folks have seen that quite a bit. So we know that they're trying to release their bishop, and now we've already got our bishop attacking, and the queen comes out here to back up the bishop. We saw that in Paul Morphy's Night at the Opera game, where he brought his queen over to back up the bishop. We saw it last week in the Evergreen game, and we see it again here. The queen, black's queen, comes out here to f6. And now we have some capturing that will happen. This c pawn now takes that pawn. And now this bishop, now that castling's happened, he comes over here to line up with the king. Remember, we've talked about that, of looking for good squares where your long-range pieces can line up with your opponent. So bishop to b6 attacks that pawn here and lines up with the king. Now, the queen came out early. Remember last week we talked about if the queen comes out early, you can attack the queen, and that's what white does. White goes to e5, attacking the queen, although this pawn is now attacked here, and attacked here, but you don't want to lose your queen, so this pawn takes. D takes e5, and now this pawn takes e5, attacking the queen, protected by the knight. Okay, so the queen moves. The queen moves to g6. Now, I've run this game through a chess analyzer. There are lots of computer programs that can analyze what's good for white and what's good for black. The one I used is Shredder. Some of you use Stockfish. And right now, the positions are roughly even. I need to speak properly. Roughly even. White may be slightly ahead. And I'll show you when white starts to lose. Queen moves there, and it's right here. White decides to attack again. Right here, they move the knight to the border to h4 to attack the queen, but gets the knight out of position. This is the moment where the tide turns against white, and you might not notice it right away because that seems like a simple move, but everything goes downhill for white right at that moment. Okay, So they attack the queen right here, and the queen simply moves to h5. Now they advance the pawn to e6, and black takes that pawn. We're going to see a lot of captures on the square in just a minute, because you can see the bishop and the queen are attacking, and the bishop's attacking right here, and that's exactly what happens. The bishop takes e6, and black bishop takes e6, and the white queen takes e6 with check. And this knight moves here, blocking. The G knight moves to e7. Now, you might be looking at this and going, oh, good. Now that the king is not moved, and the knights and bishops are cleared out here, and the knights and bishops are here, are cleared out, the king is going to be able to castle in either direction. But you need to remember, a king cannot castle through check, out of check, or into check. And notice the queen is guarding these squares and guarding these squares, taking away the king's right to castle. Black will not be able to castle here. Okay? Turns out that'll be okay. So, now, the knight is blocked. This knight now needs to move back into position, so this knight moves again here to f3, and the rook comes and attacks. We're getting the rook in position. Okay? He's going to move a little bit more, but he's getting activated. Now, white comes here to g5, attacking that knight. This is the second move that the computer analyzer really did not like. This is where, now, after this move here, black has it covered. Okay? The rook comes down and takes. And the bishop takes here. And this knight does not take the bishop. This knight comes here to d4, which does two things. It advances towards the king where it wants to be, and it attacks the queen. So a couple of things, whenever your opponent's knight moves, you should be thinking, where is that knight going? And one thing is to see that it's attacking the queen, but also to see, if you're thinking about Anastasia's mate, that it's also attacking this square right here. Remember? That would drive the king into the corner. We are getting our pieces in position right here. So the knight goes to d4. The queen comes to e4, forking the knight and the rook. The rook comes to e4 to attack the queen and protect. Now you may think that the queen should take the rook. If you're moving too quickly, that's what you would do. You'd go, oh, I'll just take the rook. But if the queen takes the rook, this knight comes here and would fork the queen, who would be on that square, and the king. And white sees that. So they know that they cannot take the rook. They cannot take the knight. So they're going off adventuring, and they come over here and they take b7. Now, many of you may remember that game I showed you several months ago when the queen goes off adventuring by herself and isn't kind of looking at the attack. The queen just came all the way over here, but look, lions and tigers and bears are coming down to attack the king. If you're white, you need to be paying attention to these. And unfortunately, white doesn't really do that. So white was not paying attention, and they needed to. So here, the king takes the bishop, and the queen takes the rook, and now black is exactly in position for Anastasia's mate, just like I showed you before. Okay? So it's black's turn to move because the queen has gone off adventuring. Notice that the queen is off by herself. None of white's pieces have any attack on the black king. And yet, black has a knight in position, a rook in position, and a queen in position. So here it comes. Remember, first the knight moves to drive the king into the corner. So the knight comes down and says, check. Nobody can block the knight. Nobody can take the knight, so the king must move. King moves to h1. Now comes the queen sacrifice. It's beautiful. Queen comes down and takes the pawn and says, check. The king must take the queen. He's got no other choice. So the king takes the queen. And remember, you can checkmate without your queen. We just need a checkmater and a helper. Here the knight guards these two squares. The pawn is blocking this square, so we have our wall of 3 up, and all the rook needs to do is come over here and say checkmate. And that is Anastasia's mate. I recommend that you review this game, or you can look online at Anastasia's mate. You can find it on chesskid.com. They have a review of this kind of mating pattern, and on Wikipedia, and it's in many books. So please look at this checkmating pattern and have fun with it over the summer. Enjoy.